Hey there, I'm Cindy Park. Today we're again joined by Jeff Jones and Mike Hogan, authors of the book Rebranding Christianity. And at the beginning of this episode, I want to have Jeff read a short passage from the book.
Yeah, this is like a freebie, right? Because you could just buy the audiobook back.
Normally you'd have to pay to hear
But
Jeff
now you don't
read.
have to buy the audiobook.
Right.
At least you get a little bit of it. So here we go. For many modern evangelicals, the rapid changes in American culture, including the shift in perspective about Christianity, have created tremendous anxiety and confusion. A persecution complex is growing as Christians feel like the world is out to get them, to strip away religious freedoms and silence their voice. Some say that the solution is to stand for the truth and be victorious when fighting with those who disagree. Many Christians think they need to battle in order to protect their freedoms and influence. In essence, they believe that they're in a culture war, but they're losing. With that line of thinking, Christians should assert their influence even more strongly so they can turn the tide and begin to win again.
The passage that Jeff just read are the opening words of the chapter titled Christians Behaving Badly. Today, Jeff, Mike, Greg, and I are going to continue our conversation that we began in the last episode. How has the Christian response to the cultural movement and events of the last few years sped up the decline of public perception of Christianity? We have a lot to talk about. Thanks for joining us.
On our last episode, we discussed recent cultural moments and events that could have been opportunities for the Christian community to demonstrate selflessness and service and radical love. Instead, by and large, we demonstrated the opposite of those things. Today, we want to talk about a cultural reality that is not particularly new, even though expressions of it in the last few years have been particularly strong. We're going to talk about culture war. What do we mean when we say the Christian culture wars? And what are the arguments in favor of culture war? And what have the culture wars done to the Christian brand? We have a full slate of things to talk about. And to just kind of get us started, Jeff, I'd love to start with you, that when you hear the term Christian culture wars, or just culture war in general, what are we talking about?
Yeah, culture war is just warring with people who disagree with us to get our point across and to make sure people agree with us, and our morality is legislated and our point of view is elevated and that kind of thing, right? So as Christians, we believe, hey, we have truth, what we believe is right, it's better, and so let's use our power to make sure our voice gets out there the strongest, that we can silence the voice as much as possible of those who disagree with us, and use kind of the weapons of this, I would say what Paul called weapons of this world, but just, get in there and speak loud, legislate morality, do everything we can to make sure our point of view is right, to try to influence the culture that way, so that you see the culture not so much as a mission field, but a battlefield.
Yeah.
And we've got to get in there and use our power to make sure people understand that we're right, and even if they don't agree with us, that our point of view is the one that gets voted in or becomes
Well, certainly within Christian circles, those who are proponents of culture war, I mean, they're holding a Bible too, so they're reading the Bible and they feel like this is what God called them to do. So tell us kind of what are the arguments in favor of culture war? Like, where does it come from in the Bible?
Well, I mean, truth is truth, right? So it would be better if people align with truth, right?
Yeah.
It's just a matter of how do we represent truth?
Yeah.
What's the most compelling way to do that? And Jesus did not do the culture war thing.
Yeah.
But I think and we can talk about that, even though he did care about truth. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying that truth is a bad thing and that it'd be better if people just rejected it.
Right.
We actually want to represent it in a compelling way, and the way of Jesus is very different than culture warring. But on the culture war side, I think a lot of that comes more from the Old Testament images of Israel as people of God. I mean, that was God's nation on this planet at that time, and he chose to set aside this nation through whom the Messiah would come, and that would be a light to the other nations. And there was warfare that happened, right, in the land as they are seizing the land. And so you have all that language, but that's not the church. That's not Christianity. That's not what Jesus came to bring. So he didn't come to establish a Christian nation. He came with this Christian counterculture called church that was a representative, that represented the kingdom above every nation on this world. And and to influence not through culture war, but through what we're really talking about, through the power of love that creates pull, that's endearing, that's compelling. So just a radically different approach to culture. But I also think really a lot of the current culture warrior kind of mentality is more about fear than about, and not in a way that people understand it. It's just, you look at America, and America is a unique nation, and, there's a lot of biblical influence in it, and you see that slipping away, and you see the generation, and all this stuff, and it is scary. And when you get into fear mode, you're either going to fight or flight, going back to high school biology. And so I think a lot of that fight is, oh my goodness, we've got to take America back. We've got to win. We're losing. Like we're look what's happening. This is terrible. And we've got to do something about it. And so let's use our power to make sure our voice is prominent and all that, which is actually counterproductive. And that's the problem with culture warring is when you war against people that you're called to love and reach, it's actually doesn't help reach them. Mm-hmm. It's repulsive, right? Every force, has an opposing, reaction, right? So you actually repulse the people that God's called us to reach. Because the truth is, culture is not a battlefield, it's a mission field. And there's a spiritual battle going on, but that's Satan. That's not people who disagree with us. People who disagree with us are people we're called to love, that we're called to pray for, that we're called to do good, that we're called to serve, even our opponents, even our enemies. And the way Jesus taught to win over a skeptical world was the opposite of culture warring. And yet, when you in fear mode and all of that, I can certainly see the confusion, right? We got to do something. Somebody's got to stand up. Yeah.
But should we be fighting for our identity as a Christian nation? Are we a Christian nation?
No. From a biblical and historical perspective, America is not a Christian nation, never has been. I'm not picking on America. That's true of every nation on this planet. Yeah. And, just like Jesus talked about with Pilate when he was arrested, and the concern was, Jesus is he's here to do an insurrection against Rome and all that. And he's like, no, I am a king. He said, Pilate said, are you a king? He said, yeah, I'm a king, but not of the nations of this world. My kingdom is above this world. And America is part of this world system. It's a unique nation in that, yes, there were some Christian principles and wonderful things embedded in our Constitution that are a blessing. But America, like every other nation, is part of the world system, part of the kingdoms of this world. Our identity as Christians is we're citizens of heaven, as Paul taught us. We're ambassadors here. We're aliens here. We're also told that we're aliens. We're not really citizens here. And we're in this strange place to represent Jesus and to point people to something bigger, not to try to create a Christian nation or legislate our morality or whatever, but to point to a kingdom above this earth and to create in the church a Christian counterculture that displays the beauty of that kingdom.
Yeah. It's tricky, though. I think that relationship between our Christian identity and how does that play out in culture and what is our responsibility, that's been one that I think Christians all throughout the history of the church have struggled with. Clearly, Jesus did not model, culture war, but even the followers of Jesus in the first generation church thought, something big was going to happen, and that, because you could look at the Old Testament examples and pair it with New Testament phrases like city on a hill, being salt and light. Like there is cultural influence that we feel like can happen. And many of us, like I can just say for me, like I feel like in my lifetime, I was probably kind of weaned on kind of moral majority age, in the 80s, and where there was a lot of Christian influence and, like that kind of stuff. And so it's easy to see why people like of my age or whatever, like when you see it slipping away, that like it's a real sense of loss, and like, what do we do with that, that sense of loss and the fear and all of that kind of thing. And it feels like it can feel like we're just giving up, to say, well, no, it's like this is, and we feel like we've got to do something. And it's a hard place.
Yeah.
It's a hard place to be.
And we do care about truth, and we do want people to connect to God. And ultimately what we want is not just for people to be moral. we want them to know Jesus, right? And then in that context, their morality will change, right? But it's changed from the inside out, not the outside in. And so it's not about, if we really want to influence a culture, it's not so much legislating morality aside from Jesus, because that's just legalism. If morality without the Holy Spirit is really not what we're trying to do. We're trying to connect people who don't know Jesus, and then to begin to live a life of submission to Him, and for their life to be changed. And we would love to influence a culture too. I mean, it's a loving thing to want to influence a culture with truth. And I mean, I want to do that even for people who don't know Jesus. Like, I know that's going to be better for them if they align with truth. But how do we represent truth? And what Jesus modeled and what the New Testament apostles, that taught, is that that's not through coercion, that's not through force, that's not through winning. It's actually the opposite. It's actually being the most loving people on the planet, the best listeners, as James says. We should be slow to anger, slow to speak, and quick to listen. In a pluralistic culture, we should be the best pluralists, the most humble, the most loving. Rather than seeing people who disagree with us as our enemy that we've got to shove down and beat, our enemies are people that Jesus taught us to love and to honor and to listen to, and which I believe is much more compelling than warring against those people, is actually rising above all that, taking the high road that then creates, and that's what the early Christians did, that wins over a skeptical world, not through coercion and force and all of that, but through compelling engagement and through endearment. And therefore, seeing people that are against us is actually not against. It's not an us against them thing. We actually realize, hey, that's us for them, and we're here for them. And part of that is we want to represent truth in a good way. But what's the compelling way to do that?
When you look through, kind of survey church history at the worst examples of like Christians behaving badly, and there are some really bad examples of when the church has really just been way off track. So often it is because of this issue of them, seeing, if you look at the Inquisition or you look at the Crusades, or you look, like some of the absolute worst examples of the church, it's when they got this wrong.
Yeah, we'll talk about it. This is a terrible, it is a real example, but it's an extreme. And if you watch the sermon series at Chase Oaks Church on Rebranding Christianity, I'm planning to use this as an example. But, I think it was June 15th, 1099, was a very dark day for the church, but they saw it as a very bright day. And what happened was, at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, they had this big worship service the day after to celebrate this battle in the First Crusade, where they had not only defeated the soldiers, the Muslim soldiers, but on the way had tortured and killed all these just innocent Jewish men, women, children, and then found all these Muslim women and children and elderly. They estimate anywhere from 5,000 to 20,000 people, and who were just praying to Allah for, protection and mercy. And they go in and slaughter all of them. And the blood was to the saddles of the horses on this big square. And just this, horrible thing, right? But they celebrate it the next day as this incredible victory over the infidel and over, and over our enemies. And you think, wow, how do you get there? We look at that and think, oh my goodness, mission drift. That's not why we're here. What are you thinking? Right? These are people we're called to reach. These are people we're called to love. These are people who need Jesus, and what happened? But they believed they were right. Yeah. And they believed they were protecting Christendom against the enemy. And we can look at that and see the obviousness of it. But I think, in our culture, and other cultures look at America and realize they see the mission drift and be like, hey, what are you doing? Yeah. And it's obvious to them. Right. They don't see America as a Christian nation. They don't see America as God's favorite. They don't see, they can see what's, reality from a different perspective. And we just need to listen to that and arrest the mission drift and realize, we're not here to war against people and defeat our enemy. We're actually here to love people, including our enemy, especially our enemy, in a way that we can win people over.
There's such an important point you made there. I just would echo it for a second, which was that, we're not saying walk away from culture change and give up or accept defeat or anything like that. I think what you're really saying is that if you really care about culture change and you want to bring about positive culture change, the way that we think about it in culture wars is actually the least effective way to get there, and radical love is actually the most effective way to get there. So even from a pragmatic perspective, right, this isn't just about a sort of an obedience thing and we're going to lose and let's accept it. This is, from a pragmatic perspective, the most effective way to bring about changes with radical love.
And I think there's a theological issue going on that if it feels weak and ineffective to say that we're just going to demonstrate love and grace and that's going to change culture. And if Jesus hadn't raised from the dead and there wasn't an indwelling Holy Spirit, it is. But he did raise from the dead, and there is indwelling Holy Spirit. And I think what the New Testament teaches is that love and grace and service and sacrifice are more than enough. And so there's probably some seeking within Christianity. It's like, do we really believe what God said? That the power within us is so much stronger than anything against us, But
it's a unique ethic, right? It's winning by losing. That's what Jesus modeled and taught.
Right.
And so you still want to win, but you win by losing.
Right.
You don't win by coercion and forcing and all that kind of thing. Yeah.
Well, under the heading of Christians behaving badly, certainly when we get this wrong and we see ourselves as cultural warriors rather than those who are called to love those within our culture, it is a very, very bad example. I want to shift gears a little bit because, Mike, you write some case studies in this book of also brands behaving badly, and you make the case that a brand can be a person, at least if they've reached a certain level of notoriety, like there's a lot of brands. And some of the examples that you raise are Facebook, Bill Cosby, Arthur Anderson, Lance Armstrong, all brands that at one point would have appeared pretty bulletproof, that because they behave badly, it's like they completely fall apart. What can the church learn? What can the church learn from Lance Armstrong? Or some of those brands that.
Sure, great question. So to your point, we included those examples, right, as a reminder that when you hitch your wagon, your brand, to a personality or, let's say, a party, like a political party, it can go well, but it might also go poorly. And sometimes, what seems like the safest bets can turn south. And I know I'm probably dating myself with this statement now, but back in the 1980s, Bill Cosby was like the safest and most marketable celebrity on the planet. And Time magazine, had him on the cover, and they called him America's Dad. Talk about falling from grace. We've also seen a lot of examples, though, of popular church leaders who've fallen from grace due to their own bad behavior. And unfortunately, when this happens, it doesn't just reflect poorly on those people, it reflects poorly on the whole church, right? People don't just say, hey, this person, they say the whole church. The world's watching and they judge us by those things. So in the context of the brand Christianity, I think this reminds us, once again, that people are unpredictable, right? But God is always faithful. And as such, we need to make sure we're putting our trust in God, not in people. It speaks to the whole issue of politicization of the church. So we care deeply about certain issues, as we've discussed here. And I understand it can be very tempting for us as a church to sort of cozy up to powerful people who happen to support some of the same causes that we support. But sometimes there's more than that happening, and that can lead to disaster. We've certainly seen that unfold in politics over the last 30 years. So I think we just need to remind ourselves that we're not supporting a person, we're not supporting a political party. What we're trying to do is carry out God's promise here, and there is no person or personality or party that's consistently pointed in that direction. So like Jeff said, our allegiances to something higher doesn't mean we don't want to work with people, but we don't want, there is no person or party that can stand up to representing the Christian brand.
Yeah. So we started this episode talking about our need to be honest with ourselves. And so some brands like Lance Armstrong have made things worse by lying and deflecting, and other brands that were in crisis took a different route and had a different result. So you talk in the book about Domino's Pizza. Can you tell us a little bit about them and what the church can learn from them?
Sure. By the way, in the interest of full disclosure, I don't personally eat at Domino's Pizza a lot, but I do actually really love the way they manage their brand, and so I think it's such a great case study. So they began with a pretty simple promise, which was pretty good pizza in 30 minutes. Didn't even promise great, right? But over time, what happened is they got busy, things happened, quality slipped, and by the late 2000s, what happened reached a critical point where Domino's customers sort of famously talked about the pizza as tasting like the cardboard box that it came out of. So that's how bad it got. This is where I think it really gets interesting, right? A lot of brands over the years have found themselves in this situation. They have a crisis, they have a person fall from grace, they have a quality issue, whatever, but it was their response that really made the difference. So I think they did three things, right? The first thing they did was they told the truth. I think most organizations or people would have sort of denied the problem, tried to cover it up, change the subject, but Domino's didn't. In fact, they went so far as to actually run advertising where people talked about how bad their pizza was. And so why did they do this? I think it's because in an increasingly cynical age, people kind of expect to be lied to, or at least to be spun, right? And telling the truth, particularly telling the truth in a very sort of radical and direct way, surprises people. In my experience, people are actually very forgiving when you just tell the truth in a very direct way. The second thing they did is they redesigned their whole business to fix the problem. Again, I think what most companies would have done is they would have said, let's make a few changes, let's have a new ad campaign, let's relaunch it as new and improved. But they actually re-engineered everything from kind of the ingredients to the preparation to the delivery, and they waited until they knew they had a product that was demonstrably better before they started telling people about it, because they knew there was a high bar. They had something to prove. There's no point in talking to people, right, about it if nothing's really changed. And then the third thing, right, is they gave it away. They went back to people who were their former customers and they said, hey, give us a second chance and here's a free pizza. They knew that that making a better impression on these people was the key to the brand coming back. And there's a theme there, right, which is the brand is brought to life through the people. In this case, the people delivering a pizza. So all this happened in the late 2000s. Just by the way of record, of the next 3 years, Domino's did make an amazing comeback. Their stock in 2007 was $3 per share. Today, it's almost $400 per share. So to put it in perspective,
did you invest?
I wish that I had. But to put it in perspective, though, during that time frame, right, from like 2010 to 2020, their stock outperformed Google, Amazon, and Apple.
Wow.
So talk about a success story.
No kidding.
And this is just pizza.
Yeah. I think the thing that I take from those stories, from Domino's, but also Lance Armstrong and Bill Cosby, like brands can respond in different ways when they engage crisis. But also, one, it's a cautionary tale that no brand is safe.
Yeah.
If Bill Cosby's not safe, then no brand is safe. And actually, what this book is, that Christianity as a brand, we own the brand, and it's not a safe brand. Like, we can't just assume that we can do whatever we want and the brand's always going to be fine. I mean, Jesus is going to build his church, but in our generation, like, it could take a tremendous hit if we're not careful. And we look at then, at least over the last two episodes, this episode and the previous episodes, we look at the cultural things that happened during COVID, and we look at sort of culture war stuff really coming to a head as things slip away. And there are a lot of examples of the church, I feel like, making, or the Christian community making bad decisions and really hurting the brand. And so we're at this point of crisis. And so then you look at, okay, do we do what Lance Armstrong did and just deny for years? Or do we do what Domino's did and just, let's just be honest, we are a long way down the wrong road and we are going to backtrack and we're sorry. And and I feel like I feel like that's kind of where we are, and I feel like that's a lot of what this book is all about.
Yeah, it is. So it's been interesting, having like non-Christians already read the book who are fascinated by it. And because it's like, hey, we know you stink. We didn't know you stink. And you're willing to admit it. It's like, and people can handle that.
Yeah.
Like, they can handle authenticity and just saying, hey, you know what? We're not who Jesus told us to be. We've drifted from that. And I know rebuilding trust is tough. You may have been hurt, disappointed. I'm sorry. It's not who Jesus is, not who we want to be. And I think people really can handle that. Mm-hmm. And then we just live out the brand, right? Just
right.
Start, address the drift, whether it's culture warring or whatever other feature, whatever manifestations of drift are, away from fear that leads to fight or flight, and instead to be animated by love, which moves toward the other, honors the other, elevates the other, represents, and to be known. Jesus didn't say, this is how people know you're my disciples if you're the most right. And make that really clear, make sure everybody knows it. He could have.
Yeah.
Because we actually are. I mean, he's given us biblical truth, but that's not what he said. He said to love the way I've loved, to be the most loving people on the planet, which actually does lead people to truth in a much more effective way than I'm right, you're wrong. Right. And so I think that's the essence of what we're talking about in this episode is, we care enough. Love and truth are not antithetical. And truth is a wonderful thing, right? It's so wonderful that if we want people to attach to Jesus, who can then help them walk in truth, then we represent him the way that he asked.
Yeah.
I feel like it's so hard to be honest with ourselves and to admit like where we've gone off course. It's much easier to engage in culture wars and to feel like our highest calling is to become some type of Christian Taliban that forces our way on everyone else. And unfortunately, we're now seeing what happens when we attack the people that God's called us to love. They don't appreciate it. And it's time we're honest about that and admit that we've gone way off course. We need to follow the example of Domino's Pizza, but taking ownership of our flaws so that we can address them is really hard to do. But that's what we've been discussing over the past few episodes, and honestly, it's been a real downer. Have you guys felt that?
Yes.
But if you've stuck with us this far, make sure to join us for our next episode as we pivot into much more encouraging conversations. What does it look like for the Christian community to make Jesus' love shine bright and become once again an irresistible force for good? We'll talk about that in our next episode of Rebranding Christianity.